So what's going on, guys? DIY Dan here again, and this is another episode of Backroads Arizona. This is actually video 2 of a sand rail rolling chassis build that I'm doing. So in video 1, guys, I actually just kind of did an overview of what I got with this car, including this LS engine, but that's about all I knew about the engine. I'm going to be showing a fast forward video of the engine teardown along with a description of what I'm doing. After I'm done tearing down the engine, I'm going to go over what I found and why I think it happened. And then I'm lightly going to go over what I'm thinking as far as the engine build. So let's get to it. So as far as identifying which LS engine I actually had, guys, I went online and went on Summit Racing, and they had a way to identify which motor I had by doing a certain amount of inspections and looking at the engine. So the first step was identifying the timing cover. The fact that it had no sensors told me it was a Gen 3 LS engine. Then I had to look at the intake manifold. It was a very tall intake, which told me it was off of a truck engine. And then the casting numbers in the block told me it was either a 4.8 or a 5.3, that it was not a 6.0. Then I was able to identify it even further by looking at the casting number on the crankshaft and seeing whether it had a return line going back to the fuel tank or whether it was returnless. So this fuel rail did have a return line going back to tank. And then I had to look at the pistons and see if they were dished or a flat top. They do have a slight dish to them, which basically tells me this is an L59 engine between the years of 2002 and 2004. So I had my daughters help me tear down this engine just so they have an understanding of how an engine works. We pulled off the intake manifold, then removed the coil packs off of the valve cover and took the valve covers off. Next, we took off the exhaust headers and remove the bolts holding the engine valley cover on. You also have to remove the NOx sensors before being able to pull that engine valley cover off. Then we took all the bolts off holding the rocker assemblies in place and removed those as a set. Then the push rods, which I cut out a box so they would hold them in order. Then we removed all the bolts for the cylinder heads and pulled those off one at a time. When tearing down an engine, you want to make sure you know exactly what position everything came from as you disassemble it. So either label it or lay it out in the position it came off the engine. For two reasons. One, if you reuse those parts, you want to put them back in the same place they were. The other aspect of this is if you're trying to figure out what happened in an engine, knowing what position certain parts came from can help you in the diagnosis. Once the cylinder heads were off, we rotated the engine around so we could remove the oil pan, the oil pickup tube, and the windage tray. Then we proceeded to pull all the rods and piston assemblies one at a time, making sure to keep track of them on which cylinder they came out of. All had gone not too bad until I pulled number 7 out and saw this. After getting all the rods and pistons out, I rotated the engine just to take a look at the rod journals on the crankshaft to see how they looked. Everything looked pretty good there. Then I flipped the engine over, removed the lifter covers, and started pulling the lifters out. Once again, keeping track of which one was in which location. You can rotate the engine to help push the lifter up a little bit so you can get a handle on it. Or a large magnet works good to help pull them up as well. I loosened the bolt on the harmonic balancer with my impact, but left it in there because I had to use a heavy-duty 3-jaw puller to pull the harmonic balancer, and that puller needed something to push against on the crankshaft. Using the puller, I pressed the harmonic balancer out as far as I could. Then I had to use a socket for a spacer against the crankshaft to the puller to push it off the rest of the way. I removed the timing cover bolts and pulled the timing cover off. Then I went ahead and pulled the oil pump off, pulled the cam gear off and the timing chain, then pulled the cover off that holds the cam in place and removed the camshaft. One thing I didn't realize, because I've never torn down an LS engine before, is they actually have a 6-bolt main. 4 main bolts going through the cap, and then 2 others on the side of the engine block going into the side of the cap. I pulled off the first main and just looked at the bearing on the bottom side because that bearing is going to be in worse shape than the top. And then saw that it was in good shape and just left the rest of it. That told me that the crank was good enough just to send it to the machine shop. And I didn't want to pull the crankshaft because it's just easier to transport it with it in the engine. In case you're wondering why I made that statement that the bottom main is going to be in worse shape than the top, that is because that is where the power stroke is going to put the most force on that crankshaft. And it's going to be the reverse of that for the rod bearings. The upper bearing is going to take more abuse than the bottom bearing. So that's going to wrap it up for the teardown of this engine, guys. My guess with how that rod got bent is I think the engine hydrolocked, because if you look at the cylinder head, between the combustion chamber and the coolant passageways is massively corroded out. So I think coolant just dumped into that cylinder, which obviously would not compress and therefore had to give somewhere, and it must have been that rod that took the brunt of that force and bent it. So the two most likely reasons that these heads corroded out this bad, one is that they did not change the coolant on a regular basis and the additives wore out of the coolant, which made it more acidic. The other being there might have been some bad grounds or corroded grounds that were not making good contact, causing a lot worse electrolysis than what would be there under normal operating conditions. Plus the fact that aluminum heads on a cast iron block don't necessarily help the situation either. So unfortunately, the cylinder heads are shot because they're all corroded out. I obviously need rods and pistons because I do have a bent rod. The lifters and push rods were kind of pretty highly worn, like they weren't doing oil changes on a consistent basis. So pretty much the only thing I can hope for here is a good block and crankshaft. And even if the crankshaft isn't that great, but the engine block is, I'll still be content because I've been debating on throwing a 383 stroker kit in this. And because these engines are so popular and so common, these engine kits are pretty reasonably priced. So it is about to be summertime in Phoenix, Arizona, guys, so I don't know when I'll be buying the engine kit for this. It'll probably be closer to the fall. And honestly, it'll all depend on what the machine shop tells me, because if this block is cracked for some reason because of that hydrolock, and it's just not something I'm seeing with the bare eye, then I'm basically looking into buying an engine anyways, so we'll have to see what happens. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you next time. Have a good one. Later.